Welcome, everyone, to this panel discussion on the very timely topic, political truth and the value of trust. My name is Karin Pettersson. I will be moderating this conversation. I'm the political editor-in-chief of Aftonbladet. And I'm very honored to have with me this extremely distinguished panel. Joseph Stiglitz, of course, one of America's most prominent public intellectuals, Nobel laureate in economics, thinker, writer, all of the above. I'm sure most of you know him. General Michael Hayden, most of you, I think, have heard him during the day, former director of the NSA and the CIA. And now also a security analyst for CNN, right? Yes. And Zeynep Tufekci, writer, academic, and my favorite title in the world, techno-sociologist, and a thinker about the internet. And as I said, political truth and the value of trust is our topic. And I want to start out with two quotes by two politicians. And one is by the former American President Barack Obama, who said that if the people cannot trust their government to do the job for which it exists, to protect them and to promote their common welfare, all else is lost. So trust is central. And then we have a politician with a different background. I trust no one, not even myself. That's Stalin. So this is the range we're talking about. I want to ask all of you this question. What is the value of trust in democratic societies? And what happens when it disappears? Professor Stiglitz, do you want to start?
Well, I think trust is obviously absolutely essential. Maybe I should begin by thinking about it, what is the role of trust in markets, in the economy? Because we often think about markets based on contracts, demand and supply. We don't talk about trust. But when you realize that every day we have relations with other people that are not contractually defined. And if we had to go to court every time we had a difference, our whole economic system would break down. So that, in fact, trust is, ironically, essential for a market economy. The example where that broke down was in 2008 when we had a financial crisis. No bank would trust any other bank because they knew how bad they were and how they were lying. So they had every reason not to trust everybody else. And once they didn't trust, they wouldn't lend to anybody else. And when they didn't lend to anybody else, the whole financial system collapsed. So that's a sort of a dramatic illustration of the role of trust in the functioning of our society. But it happens pervasively. Well, the same thing is true in our democracy. And we're going through, you might say, in the United States, an interesting experiment. Almost nobody trusts anything that the president says, but they do trust our institutions. So the president makes utterances all the time, as if he expects it to have any truth value, that somebody would, but everybody knows that, he lies when it's convenient, so it has no probative value, it wouldn't stand up. So yet he makes these statements. But where our society is continuing to function is that we have trust in a whole set of other institutions. The fact that he is engaged in an assault on these institutions, as you described earlier, shows that he recognizes the importance of these other institutions. And so, if you wanted a nightmare scenario to ask, how would our democracy function if these other institutions weren't there? I can't conceive of what that, it is a nightmare scenario. And so far, at least, I think we're lucky that these institutions, and there are some others, like the importance of the civil service, which is a whole, we often demonize it as the bureaucracy, but the function of that bureaucracy is to make sure that the rules, the laws and regulations are enforced, and our knowledge that we've accumulated about how that they work is perpetuated. And he's trying to do what he can to destroy that. You see it most dramatically in the State Department, but it's elsewhere in our government. So, for now, we can be thankful that we have this residual of trust, but it is obviously a real source of worry what will happen if it gets weaker.
So that's going from the functioning of the market economy and the transactional costs, basically, and also the trust in governmental institutions. General Hayden, what is the value? I'll get back to you and your specific background and trust, but can you elaborate on this question, the value of trust for democracy specifically?
Sure. So in general terms, second, all that's been said, and in addition to the assault on the free press, fake news, and so on, there is a broad generalized thrust against the permanent government, is the phrase I use, as an anti-democratic deep state, all right, that's actually working very, very hard, very, very secretly, to overturn the results of the election, or if not the results of the election, the intent of the people who elected President Trump. And that's a storyline, that's a narrative that permeates discussion about this back home. I have a specific issue with trust in government with my own professional background, because trust in the intelligence community has been up and down over the past 10 or 15 years. Weapons of mass destruction, a clear error, all right? Not a sin, not a crime, and no gun to our head. We just got it wrong. And so the problem we have as an institution is that the dialogue about intelligence is often confused with the kinds of certainty that one might get from science or from a court of law. And what I'm fond of saying is that we're not designed, not that we don't mind getting there, not that we would not work hard to get to this point, but the institution is not designed to get to the point of certainty that we get to in a court of law beyond all reasonable doubt, because in the realm within which we work, waiting to get to beyond all reasonable doubt simply means you lose, that you've lost all advantage, that your nation is being acted on rather than acting. So the purpose of intelligence is actually to enable action even in the face of lingering doubt. There, the question of trust really becomes very, very important. And so if we have created circumstances, and frankly, you mentioned everything the president says can be held up to the light and might actually be a lie. My great fear is that the American intelligence community will tell him something, which will be ambiguous because that's what we do, but we'll do it to the degree we can substantiate high confidence. And in this case, maybe the president believes us, but nobody believes him. And I'm serious. And when he goes to your capitals to say, we got to go do this, are you with me? And there may be, I'll get back to you as the strongest response, and it's based upon trust. And again, back to the bloodline, back to the institution, because we will probably never be able to give him a case in which the response, the answer, the way forward is so intuitively obvious that some level of faith or trust is not required.
So, Zeynep, Tufekci, I want to continue this conversation, but I want to add an aspect, because we seem to get stuck. I mean, there's so much going on right now, and Trump is this trauma, I mean, not just for the US, but for the globe, the entire globe. But I also, the discussion of trust isn't new. There was we talked about this even before Trump got elected. So I also want to ask you, what is the role of trust, but also how did we get here and how did we lose it?
That's a great question. Earlier on, General Hayden was talking about how the president seems to live in the eternal now. And Maggie Haberman, who's the New York Times columnist, also was talking about that. I think it's really important, as important as it is, to try to figure out how do we survive this moment? How did we get here? And I think lack of accountability and sort of questioning of the failures of our existing institutions that we need right now, right? We need them right now, has really helped us get here. So start with, say, the New York Times, right? I write for the New York Times. It's a great paper. It's got amazing investigations. But its roll up to the Iraq War, which you just brought up, was a huge failure. It was a failure in reporting. It was a failure in all sorts of ways. And I believe one person perhaps lost their job over that, and it hasn't really been reckoned with how the US press got there. In the 2016 election, US press was pretty, I would say, again, I think it's very important to protect the New York Times kind of institutions, but its conduct up to the election in terms of how it covered candidate Trump and candidate Hillary Clinton, how it responded to, say, the WikiLeaks things, I think it failed badly. We don't discuss it. I criticize Facebook and Google all the time. That's my topic. We don't discuss mainstream media and their failures and how we got there. I think 2008, the global crisis was a major thing. In the United States, about 1 in 5 adult men either lost their job or came close to losing their job. There's a way in which the global economy is failing many ordinary people in very severe ways, as helpful as it may be to the global middle class. We don't discuss it. It took Donald Trump to bring some of this up. I want to go back to the Iraq War, which seems to be the thing that never gets discussed in the sort of the public sphere as much, in that it was terribly destructive to the region. It was wrong in many ways. As you said, the weapons of mass destruction part turned out to be not true. And there has never been full accounting for what that meant. There has never been full accounting for everything that came after it. There's never been full accounting for, there's been this loss of institutional trust, I think, that goes back to decades of our institutions that I defend, that I'm part of, that here we are sitting, we're part of, that we failed in fundamental ways, structural ways. We fail to be responsible, we fail to be unaccountable. And when we get something wrong, we're like, oh, we just got something wrong, and we move on, whereas lives are destroyed in large numbers. So I think the moment we're facing right now is that we have these weaknesses, and dangerous currents are coming through those weaknesses. And I believe we're at a very dangerous moment globally. But I feel like we're almost lucky that in the case of the US, we have a reality TV star that got elected. You know, we can probably survive this moment because we have institutions. But if we do not fix, I think, the accountability, transparency, gaining trust, how do we do right by the people in a way that makes sense for the people? I feel like we're just going to live through this again and again with more dangerous ones coming again. And I think we should really be discussing that as much as discussing, you know, what does Donald Trump get wrong?
So what you're saying is that this moment is a result of something. And of course, I'm going to give the word to Professor Stiglitz, who has been studying the connection between trust and economic inequality and kind of the macro fundamentals driving us towards this, maybe. Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, and the title of the session was Political Truth. And one of the reasons that I think there's been the loss of trust is that for a third of a century, we've had political leaders who said that globalization, advances in technology, were going to lead everybody to be better off. And so you had a strong agenda, and even under Obama, they were saying TPP was going to, new trade agreement across the Pacific, was going to have enormous benefits. And what people were experiencing was just the opposite. And I think a critical point, as mentioned, was the 2008 crisis. And why it was critical was, it was at that moment that you saw that things had not worked out well. We had not created a financial system that was stable, that would benefit everybody. The banks were engaged in predatory lending, and then we saw market manipulation, a whole set of abuses. And two things happened. The bankers walked off with huge bonuses. Ordinary Americans lost their homes and their jobs, and there was no accountability.
Exactly.
Much less accountability than happened after the much smaller crisis, the SNL crisis that nobody remembers now in the 1989. Mm-hmm. So there's a sense that the system has no system of accountability. And then, in one sense, making it one sense worse is we had a president, previous president, got elected on a platform of change you could believe in, and continued with the same economics team that had brought on the crisis in the first place. And so you seem to have a political system that was not accountable, that was lying if you were going to, and I don't know if, they were clearly overselling globalization. They were overselling. And when, just to highlight one more little aspect of the irony, when the government itself came and evaluated how much would TPP, this agreement that was supposed to be the largest trade agreement ever, the government came and evaluated and said the net effect on our growth over, when it was fully implemented in 15 years, was 0.15% of GDP. An independent evaluator said that was a gross exaggeration. What that said is there's something else going on in this agenda. You've just made this the biggest thing ever, and it's nothing. What are you doing? And that fits into, you might say, a conspiracy theory. What this is all about is corporate power. And it was all about, it wasn't that workers' wages going down was collateral damage in the way that's often happened. This was the main show. It was really to weaken workers' bargaining power and increase inequality.
So what you're saying, if I understand you correctly, is that the collapse of trust happened before, and Trump is the effect of the collapse of trust. Because if people don't believe in politics anymore, then they might just as well, elect someone who's at least entertaining.
Well,
or something.
He is the consequence of a lack of trust, but the damage that he's done is enormous. So, it's gone down, it was going down, but what's happened since then is a precipitous fall. So, no, I think you have to really blame him. But in a way, he took advantage of a decline in trust, and it's taken a bad problem and made it infinitely worse.
But do you think he would have been elected if the levels of trust in politics had been higher?
I don't think he would have been elected.
Yeah.
I think he is the consequence of our failures.
Yeah, but look, both political parties ran a primal scream to be the president of the United States. All right? The Democrats were wired in such a way that the party could prevent that person from becoming the nominee. The Republicans could not. But both were running a primal scream.
So you have been talking about this, but I want to dig into this question because it really comes back to the former then generation, or the last two generations of politicians, of public officials, I guess your generation. Where did you go? Where did you go wrong?
I'd say accountability is at the heart of it. I think people feel like they've lost sovereignty. I feel like, the 2008 crisis happens and everybody walks away. The Iraq war happens, destroys both American and Iraqi lives and the region, everybody walks away. When the establishment, when the people in power make mistakes, we walk away in ways that I think the people affected by do not walk away. And then in places where they vote, they're like, vote for the person who's promising to burn it down. In places where there's no vote, I think they join extremist groups, they join terrorism. I think there's a way in which we are not providing people with a world in which that they don't think everything is stacked against them, and the ways in which they could win are peaceful, and that they are open avenues to them. And I'm not saying this to exculpate anybody's bad decisions, right? Everybody's responsible for their own moral decisions. So people who make those wrong decisions, they're responsible for them. Trump is responsible for himself. But I feel like, how do we set up structures so that when you look at the world, you don't think the people in power, whatever they do, they get away with it? And I think that's a whole big thing that we have to face, as much as I agree with the fact that we are facing a dangerous moment right now, too.
Okay. So I think one has to realize, I think many of the people who were acting in this period over the last 30 years that set up these problems were acting in good faith. I think there was a prevalent ideology, both in Europe and America. Here you refer often to as neoliberalism. It permeated both parties in the United States. There were dissident voices, but they were a small minority. And like any ideology, it becomes very strong. And so when you raised arguments like, economic science, economic theory predicts that unskilled workers are going to be made worse off, the response is, somehow, and that was, as the economy grows, everybody is going to be better off. There's going to be trickle-down economics. And it was just an article of faith, no structure, but it was an article of faith felt, as I say, by a lot of goodwill people, but also a lot of people who saw it in their self-interest. And it was that combination of corporate interest and an ideology that worked together that made this a prevalent view. And then in the absence of accountability means that a system that, you might say, lies from authority, lies in the sense that they made predictions and those predictions didn't come true. Nobody was held accountable, and I think that really contributes to the weakening of trust.
This is all true, unarguable, but I also think there's a structural issue that's created the lack of responsiveness from the government over the last 10, 20, or 30 years. And at the risk of sounding less like an American intelligence officer and more like a political science professor, we have allowed our electoral districts in our states to be gerrymandered, and it happens every decade in sequence with our census. And the Republicans are a little more guilty of this than the Democrats, but in essence, we get to redraw our electoral districts. And what the parties have done is to redraw the districts so that almost none of them are competitive. That this will be a Republican district, this will be a Democratic district, so that the general election, that outcome is foreordained. It's going to go either red or blue. The only election that matters is the primary. Who's going to be the Republican nominee? Who's going to be the Democrat nominee? And that dynamic has the dynamic of pulling the representative further to the corner so that Republicans become more red, more conservative over time, Democrats more blue, more liberal over time, vacating the center space. And so what we now have, which makes us unresponsive, are a body of folks in the Congress with no personal guilt, right? But just the reality of how this works, who are very red and very blue and see everything through the wellness, the goodness, the advantage for the party rather than to the nation. So to get to the bottom line, there are no body of facts that Bob Mueller will uncover that will cause a Republican-controlled House of Representatives to draw up articles of impeachment on Donald Trump, period.
So, but I mean, here's the thing, though. The lack of bad faith is often true. Sometimes not, sometimes it's just self-interest, right? The bankers, they were just making a lot of money. That's why you build institutions to protect people from believing they're doing the right thing. Because everybody who does the wrong thing, like not everybody, but a lot of times people do wrong things telling themselves, I'm doing the right thing, right? That's the value of institutions. And I feel like a lot of our institutions have done things where people at each level feel like, this is what I have to do. And then they cross those lines, and then we lose trust in the institutions themselves. So how do we build that?
So let's come back to the now and talk about the present moment. And I want to ask you, Zeynep, because you're an expert on the internet and this new information infrastructure that we're living with. I'm thinking of the big platform companies, Facebook and Google, and we've been talking about this today, social media. Do they promote trust or do they undermine it? And how should we think about this layer of technology that we have to interact with each other through?
So the current social media environment, they don't have trust necessarily as a goal even. Like, so if our old-style institutions failed from providing the truth and facts to us, as the Iraq War example I just gave, the current ones, they just want your attention. They just want your attention to sell to the advertisers. For them, New York Times, Guardian News, which is a fake newspaper, it doesn't really matter as long as they got your eyeballs and they got your data and they're selling it to the advertisers, which is a very pernicious development on top of all of this. So we already had these failing institutions that were failing from at least ethos we could defend. We had lack of accountability for them, and I include the press, I include the academy, which I'm part of, I include the intelligence services, I include the US government. We all failed from what we should have been. And now you got these things, they're not even failing from that, right? All they care about is, are you clicking, are you there? This combination is such a dangerous moment where you have, this is kind of reminds me, like I'm obsessed with the period between World War I and World War II, where you have this sort of failing trust in institution and new means of propaganda, in that case film, right? The triumph of the will kind of thing, rising at the same time, and demagogues going through that. And I think we're pretty similar in a lot of the dynamics.
Yeah,
there.
but yes, can I just, can I just give you a question, add on a question to that? Because many people make that comparison, but what we don't have today is an economic crisis. We don't have hyperinflation, we have a
luckily.
Sorry?
Very luckily, yeah.
Very, very luckily, but at the same time, there is this level of rage that is just there seems to be like a mismatch between the level of rage and the actual macro fundamentals sometimes to me. Do you agree with that? Or is it inequality or?
Well, in the United States, I think we do have a crisis.
Yes.
Because the inequality is so bad. Life expectancy in the United States, on average, is in decline. And if you look at those groups, white males, say, who are not college educated, their life expectancy is on marked decline. And from diseases of despair, things like suicide, drug overdose, alcoholism. And the only other time I've seen something like that in the data is when the Soviet Union collapsed in Russia, and there was a complete dissolution of society, and life expectancy goes down. So we have a symptom in the United States of something that is troublesome. You can have a problem if there's a marked discrepancy between expectations and reality and fear. And people looking around, saw how many people lost their jobs, how many people lost their homes. There is a real sense of fear. But I wanted to go back and answer the question, the way in which I see the Facebook, for instance, contributing to the lack of trust, really fits in with what you said, which is that it reinforces echo chambers. Because you want clicks, and the way the clicks go, you have like, and so if you're interacting a lot, they want news. They like things that trend. They like people to interact, and that creates exactly the kind of framework that takes off. You have a more divided society that sees things in very different ways. So if you have the two parties seeing the truth, whatever, in such different light, there's no way that you can have trust in our institutions, because whatever the government does, the other group will say, it's wrong, the facts are not there. at this point, the United States is the only country in which there are very large numbers of climate deniers. And, and if the government does anything, they'll say, the climate deniers are saying it's been taken over by a bunch of liberals, and if they don't, the other group gets angry. So as an area where there is an objective truth, but our system has moved so far away from that truth that you have a majority of one of the political parties not believing in climate science. And so strongly, one of the ironies is normally if you ask, are more educated people more likely to believe in climate change? Almost everywhere you would say, yes, more educated people understand. In the United States, that's not true. Why is that? Because on average, more educated people belong to the Republican Party, and they're wealthier.
Back to the ideological purity rather than evidence-based.
Exactly. So it's ideological driven, and so you get this inverse correlation, which is very strong, but sort of highlights the challenge that we have in restoring trust.
So we have the macro fundamentals, which doesn't look so good, especially in the US. We have this new layer of technology that is not making things better, to say the least. And we have this moment. So I'm interested in the question how we should act. What's the responsibility of civil servants, of us as citizens, and General Hayden, with your background and thinking about the community that you have been a part of, what can the intelligence community, for example, do if your country has a leader that won't accept facts, for example? What is your responsibility? Should you continue working and delivering facts, or should you give facts to the should you deliver the facts to the public? What do you do in this extraordinary situation?
It's a wonderful question. So if you recall what I said this morning, I mean, rarely do we go in there with a syllogism and where the outcome is obvious and preordained. You set the left and the right-hand boundaries. So to a first order, there's space here in which other legitimate factors can play, value, ideology, priority, and so on, all right? But you do have an ethical obligation to say something to somebody when the policy is outside the bounds. And in effect, you've either divided by zero over here, and this can't work, or you've made the assumption you can make water go uphill over here, and that's not going to work either. You know this is a failing policy. So you hold the debate within the executive branch. I have never personally had to go ahead and push the plunger, so to speak, and blow something up. The closest I came was the President Bush's decision for the surge in 2006, early 2007, in which we sent 5 combat brigades to make right what had gone badly wrong in Baghdad. Our assumption was you put those 5 professional, non-sectarian brigades of combat power in the city, you're going to push the violence down. You're going to achieve that objective. But we actually said to the president, but that's not your big plan. Your big plan is to create space for the Iraqi Prime Minister, Nouri al-Maliki, to actually become the Prime Minister of Iraq, rather than of the Dawa party and of the Shia. And we made it very clear, that is not a high probability shot. All right? If he will have to govern beyond his life experience, and for lots of reasons, and we articulated it. So there we are, and the president says, got it, send the 5 brigades. And so that decision, to my mind, was kind of about here. Now, the president insisted on having a personal video teleconference with the Prime Minister of Iraq every week for the rest of his administration, in which he was trying to coach and mentor. So that's been my experience, all right? You don't determine, you do affect. If you're out here and you know it's going to fail, it's really hard. One path forward is to talk to the other political branch of government. We're also beholding, and in our system, far more so than a parliamentary system, you can make things known to another co-equal competing branch of government. So that's one. And then, in an emergency break glass, it's going public, which again, as I tried to suggest earlier today, breaks the norms of the profession by saying things publicly that are genuinely and correctly classified. And so it creates a horrific dilemma. One other point, I know I'm going too long here. Traditionally, presidents run the things they say by the intel community. You get a look at certainly prepared remarks. And you get to say, you may say that if you want, but if asked, we can't back it up, which for most presidents is plenty of reason enough to drop it out of the speech. I see so many things in President Trump's commentary that I can't believe that process is ongoing. And so I think what the leadership is just doing the best they can within the circumstances they find themselves and are not yet ready to break glass because they haven't gotten to that position.
Okay, so we have three great minds here, and we have a problem, and we need to fix it, right? We have a collapse of trust. We have new information infrastructure. We have macroeconomic problems, and we have this collapse of trust in political leadership. What should we do then? Zeynep, do you want to?
Well, all right, in 30 seconds, here's the answer. Well, I'm going to just say one little thing, and then I'll get to the answer, is that I think I keep going back to the accountability thing. Something I worry about a lot is terrorism, because these platforms have been great for extremist content. These platforms, ISIS has been recruiting through this. I'm an anti-censorship person my whole life, and I wrote one of the first op-eds calling for Facebook and Twitter to kick them off the platforms, because I don't think it's a free speech issue. I think this is something I worry about all the time. And when I hear sort of this discussion of, what you just said on like the surge thing, right? This is something that the current situation in the Middle East is fueling an enormous amount of terrorism. But one of the things we still haven't dealt with and how to move forward is that we broke our own norms in that war, right? We broke our norms. It came public that US tortured detainees, and we've not dealt with it. Trust me, that comes up every day in the Middle East. That comes up all the time. Now it's a whataboutism, there's so much more going on there. But there are ways in which I think we haven't dealt with how we broke our norms and why. And how do we move forward from there, that I think is fueling a lot of these big issues that we kind of keep dancing around. So before we go forward with, here's my 30-second answer, I feel like the people who've been in power the past 20, 30 years, we have to sort of have these really frank conversations about accountability and how do we move on. The second thing is we have to also defend these faulty institutions and rebuild them for the 21st century so that we have cultural antibodies, institutional antibodies, we have ways of defending truth and facts. But I don't think we can do it if we ignore what happened since then, which makes it really tricky. I wish we had this conversation 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago on a lot of things. In that the simultaneous thing is that we build our new institutions to this new world, but we also sort of sit down and say, how did we fail from our norms that keep us strong, that makes us special, that are the ones that are worth defending? And then we move forward.
General Hayden, I'm going to ask you, maybe this is unfair, but I'll ask you this because I think many people outside of the US wonder about how can you let him keep on for this long? Like, why is no one stopping him on the, within the Republican Party? Like, where are you talk so much about checks and balances in your political system,
yeah.
But why aren't people standing up and why isn't the critique from the Republican Party louder?
Yeah.
And you talked about gerrymandering and polarization, and that's of course a big part of it, but there seems to be something lacking in terms of, I don't know, courage or values. Can you talk about this?
Yeah, sure, but it's uneven.
Not for, and maybe this is not fair, but just as a You said that you wanted to be a political science professor.
So it's been uneven, and
Yeah.
I share disappointment within the political leadership, particularly the Republican Party. Again, the Democrats will be reflexively contrary. It doesn't matter what the president does. It's the Republicans who are the tiebreakers. And when the Republicans begin to act in a different way, then you know something real is taking place. But I would offer you hope the way I try to offer myself hope, which is the sound you hear from Washington is not the destruction of American institutions. The sound you hear from Washington is American institutions standing their ground. And I said somewhere this morning, and that includes the Boy Scouts of America and the National Football League and the intelligence community and the FBI and American journalism and so on. They are holding their ground. So much so that I think we've said on this panel that the assault now has been on the institutions, because he knows he cannot succeed as long as these institutions are viable in doing what it is they are designed to do. So it's game on. In terms of that. And frankly, I think we come out of this at the other end a bit purged, a bit purified, a bit better at what it is we do. I hate quoting a movie.
You think we will?
Yeah, I hate quoting a movie, but America, like the dude, will abide.
Yeah. What if we have? What about? Yeah. I'm worried about war.
War? Yeah, so me too. And the probability of war in Northeast Asia is as high as it's been in my professional life. And that is due to my country stimulating the situation.
Yeah.
Now, to be fair, and here comes back to maybe the secret sauce as to how you do these things back home. You just can't be reflexively negative and just say, well, he did it, so it must be a bad idea. A couple of years ago, I said, look, within our current definition of acceptable risk, it is inevitable that North Korea, by the end of this president's administration, will have a nuclear weapon on top of an indigenous ICBM that can range most of North America. So the option is, do you want to change your current definition of acceptable risk? Which is what the president has done. That is not irrational. That maybe not my policy, but it is a policy that holds together and reflects a healthy response to an external environment. Now, I think they're handling it horribly, all right? But it is, the broad framework of it has a great deal of rationality attached to it. And so the debate back home has to be on the specifics of the policy and not turn everything into an ad hominem attack, despite the fact that the Homo sapiens, in this case, may deserve attack, but not turn it into an ad hominem attack as your first reflex.
Professor Stiglitz, after the financial crisis, you wrote in an essay that trust in the economy can only be rebuilt through stronger regulation, basically strengthening institutions. Is that even possible in today's political situation? And how do we get from where we are to where that might be a possibility?
Well, maybe the way to begin is actually pick up where we just left off, which is that American institutions have done remarkably well in holding off the worst of Trump. And two questions that we never asked 10 years, 20 years ago: what is truth? You know, that would be in a philosophy department, but you wouldn't be asking it, discussing what is truth in a public forum, and we are. And how do our institutions protect us against a president who's a liar and a racist and misogynist and has values different and maybe has his finger on a button that we don't like? Can they protect us? So I think the good news is that we've realized more the fragility of our situation, that these are questions that we should have been asking before. I think it feeds into a movement that was already going on, that a complex society such as ours, civil society has to take a larger role. You know, we used to say government, private sector, Now we say government, private sector, and civil society. And civil society is very, very important as part of the checks on that. For the past third of a century, the private sector, the corporate has been trying to tell us, don't worry, government doesn't function, but we do, and we will deliver. That story is over, I think. And so what we do need to do is to have civil society and government work together, and hopefully with a lot of corporate engagement to say, after World War II, there was a lot of discussion in Europe of the social partners, and to say we have to build a framework of working together as a society. And then the final comment I want to make is the United States lives in a global context. And many of us are working very hard not to normalize to prevent from the normalization of the kind of behavior that has characterized Trump and what's been happening in the Republican Party. Most of the world is not in the United States. And we are, globally a small part of the world. And if the rest of the world comes down very strongly and says, you can't live in this imaginary world, you are living in an imaginary world, and that's not truth, that is going to play a very important role. So I think it's going to be very important. I think it's very important for other countries not to give in and to say as it is. And it's uncomfortable. Everybody wants to cooperate with the United States. And the answer is we cooperate where it is, where what you're saying is reasonable. But if you're saying something that's unreasonable, we're not going to cooperate. And I think that's an important message that has to be given. So the world, say the Paris Agreement is an example where the rest of the world is going ahead. Trump is trying to destroy the WTO and is not allowing the appointment of new judges to the WTO panel. So I think the rest of the world is going to say, we believe in a fair, rules-based system. We didn't have it quite because it was a corporate agenda, but we believe in that, and we are not going to allow the United States to destroy it. And if you're not going to play game, that's your problem. We're going to go ahead with these institutions with or without the United States.
Even with mature Western democracies, the channel of communication, intelligence to intelligence service, has become greatly enriched over the last 12 months because these are institutions in both societies that are generally fact-based.
30 seconds.
Yes.
I think people have to step up. When that Muslim ban where banned travel from so many countries that you said earlier fed to the worst propaganda of the worst extremists, you know what neutralized that?
Yeah.
Millions, maybe tens of thousands of Americans went to the airports and said, this is not who we are. And that was on so many screens, that was on social media. I think we can no longer just also let the institutions, it's the people stepping up and saying, this is not who we are, I think undermined the damage that wrong-headed ban did to a great degree, because the world looked and said, oh, they're just like us. They have a bad government, but they're good people there. And I think it's time for everybody who's concerned about truth, who's concerned about facts, who's concerned about living in a world together, we can't just outsource it to our governments, anybody else. We have to step up as people too.
So I think that's a perfect place to stop. We should see this moment as a wake-up call, basically. Yes. That's the takeaway. Thank you so much.